February 17th, 1983. Miami Herald front page headline: Cocaine Queen Griselda Blanco killed in car explosion. The photograph showed a mangled Mercedes-Benz, twisted metal scattered across Biscayne Boulevard, smoke still rising from the wreckage. Federal investigators confirmed finding human remains in the vehicle, along with jewelry and identification belonging to the notorious drug trafficker. DEA agents celebrated. Rival cartels breathed sighs of relief. Prosecutors closed active investigations. The woman they called La Madrina, the most dangerous drug trafficker in American history, was finally dead. Except she wasn't. 6 months later, when federal agents conducted coordinated raids across 12 states, they discovered something that would redefine everything they thought they knew about criminal intelligence and strategic deception. Griselda Blanco had not only survived the explosion that was supposed to have killed her, she had orchestrated it herself. And while the entire world believed she was dead, she had built the most sophisticated criminal empire in the history of the Western Hemisphere. This is the story of the greatest deception ever pulled on law enforcement, and how a woman everyone thought was in her grave became more powerful than she had ever been while alive. To understand how Griselda managed to fake her own death so convincingly, you need to understand the pressure she was facing by early 1983. Federal investigators had been closing in on her organization for over 2 years. The Medellin cartel had put a $5 million bounty on her head. Mexican trafficking groups were offering $2 million for information leading to her location. Griselda realized that her reputation, which had been her greatest asset, had become her greatest liability. Everyone knew who she was, what she looked like, where she operated. She had become too famous to function effectively. But instead of going into hiding, Griselda chose a third option that no one had considered possible. She would disappear completely and re-emerge as someone entirely different. The plan she developed was breathtaking in its complexity. It would require months of preparation, millions of dollars in flawless timing. Most importantly, it would require sacrifices that would have been unthinkable to most people. The first step was creating a perfect body double. Through contacts in the entertainment industry, Griselda had identified a woman named Maria Santos, a Colombian actress who bore a striking resemblance to her. Over 6 months, Griselda had extensive plastic surgery performed to make Maria's appearance even more identical to her own. Maria was told that the resemblance was needed for a sophisticated banking fraud and that her role would be to impersonate Griselda at business meetings. What Maria didn't know was that Griselda was planning to sacrifice her life to make the deception perfect. The second step was establishing a completely new identity. Working with the best forgers money could buy, Griselda became Carmen Vasquez, a middle-aged widow from Venezuela who had immigrated to the United States after her husband's death. Carmen Vasquez had a complete background story supported by decades of fabricated records, school transcripts from Caracas, marriage certificates, death certificate for her fictional husband, immigration papers, employment records from several legitimate businesses in South Florida. Most importantly, Carmen Vasquez looked nothing like Griselda Blanco. Extensive plastic surgery had changed the shape of Griselda's face. Her nose, her jawline, hair coloring and styling made her appear 10 years older. Even her closest associates would have difficulty recognizing her. The third step was gradually transferring control of her entire organization to Carmen Vasquez while making it appear that Griselda was still actively managing all operations. Over several months, key lieutenants were introduced to Carmen as Griselda's special consultant for expansion into Venezuelan markets. By February 1983, Carmen Vasquez was effectively running Griselda Blanco's entire empire, but no one in law enforcement knew that Carmen existed. The fourth step was the most dangerous, staging the assassination that would convince the world that Griselda Blanco was dead. On the morning of February 17, 1983, Maria Santos was told that she needed to meet with important financial contacts at a restaurant in downtown Miami. She was instructed to wear specific jewelry that belonged to Griselda and to carry identification in Griselda's name. What actually happened was that Maria was killed when a bomb exploded in the Mercedes-Benz she was driving to the meeting. The explosion was massive, designed to ensure that identification of the remains would be difficult but not impossible. During the crucial weeks while investigators processed the scene, the entire world operated under the assumption that Griselda Blanco was dead. and that assumption gave Carmen Vasquez the freedom to build something unprecedented. While federal agents celebrated and rival cartels fought over territories Griselda had supposedly left vacant, Carmen Vasquez was systematically taking control of drug trafficking operations throughout the Americas. The genius of her strategy was that no one was looking for Carmen. Law enforcement agencies had closed their investigations. Rival organizations had moved their attention to other targets. But instead of collapsing, the network was expanding faster than ever before. Within 30 days of Griselda's death, Carmen had established new distribution networks in Atlanta, Houston, and Los Angeles. She had negotiated partnerships with Mexican trafficking groups who believed they were dealing with an entirely independent organization. She had opened new smuggling routes through Central America. Most importantly, she had begun recruiting personnel who had no connection to Griselda's previous operations. Young, intelligent, ambitious individuals who could operate without the baggage of association with known criminal networks. By the end of March 1983, Carmen Vasquez was generating more revenue than Griselda Blanco had ever achieved, but doing it through an organization that was completely invisible to law enforcement. The sophistication of Carmen's operation was beyond anything federal agents had ever encountered. Instead of relying on violence and intimidation, Carmen built her empire on business principles that would have impressed legitimate corporate executives. She established multiple layers of legitimate businesses that provided perfect cover for money laundering. Import-export companies, real estate development firms, restaurant chains. Each business was profitable on its own, making detection of criminal activity virtually impossible. She created sophisticated communication systems that used coded language embedded in legitimate business correspondence. Orders for cocaine shipments were disguised as requests for coffee imports. Most revolutionarily, Carmen established what she called community investment programs in areas where she operated. She funded schools, medical clinics, and job training programs, building genuine support among local populations who had no idea they were being helped by a drug trafficking organization. Within 4 months, Carmen Vasquez had achieved something that law enforcement officials would later describe as impossible. She had built a criminal empire that was also genuinely beneficial to the communities where it operated. But the most audacious aspect of Carmen's strategy was still to come. In June 1983, federal investigators began receiving anonymous tips about competing trafficking organizations. What investigators didn't realize was that Carmen Vasquez was providing them with intelligence about her rivals. Using her knowledge of other criminal organizations, Carmen systematically fed information to law enforcement agencies that resulted in the arrest of competitors throughout the Americas. She was using law enforcement as a weapon against her rivals while building her own empire in the territories they left vacant. By August 1983, 6 months after Griselda's supposed death, Carmen Vasquez controlled drug trafficking operations in 17 states and 12 countries. Her organization employed over 3,000 people, most of whom believed they were working for legitimate businesses. Her annual revenue exceeded $500 million, making her the most successful criminal entrepreneur in history. The revelation came in September 1983 when federal agents conducting a money laundering investigation discovered financial records that didn't make sense. A business executive named Carmen Vasquez appeared to be managing transactions that were far too large for the legitimate company she supposedly represented. Agent Robert Chen of the DEA began investigating Carmen's background and quickly realized that her documented history didn't match the sophistication of her current operations. The breakthrough came when Agent Chen obtained security camera footage from a restaurant where Carmen had been meeting with associates. Enhanced analysis suggested that Carmen might be someone who had undergone extensive plastic surgery. When forensic specialists compared Carmen's bone structure to photographs of known criminals, they found a match that seemed impossible. Carmen Vasquez was surgically altered, but her underlying physical characteristics were identical to those of Griselda Blanco. On September 23, 1983, federal agents conducting surveillance witnessed something that confirmed their suspicions. They saw Carmen Vasquez remove a wig revealing hair that had been dyed to match Griselda Blanco's natural color. They saw her transform from a middle-aged Venezuelan widow into the commanding presence that had made Griselda legendary. Agent Chen immediately contacted prosecutors with a report that would have seemed like science fiction. Griselda Blanco had faked her own death, undergone extensive plastic surgery, and built the largest criminal empire in American history while everyone believed she was in her grave. The coordinated raids that followed were the largest law enforcement operation in DEA history. Over 2,000 federal agents conducted simultaneous searches in 17 states and 12 countries. But when agents arrived at Carmen's headquarters, they found something stunning. Detailed financial records showing that Carmen's organization had generated over $500 million in 6 months. Personnel files for over 3,000 employees, most of whom had no criminal backgrounds. Most shocking, they found evidence that Carmen had been providing information to law enforcement agencies about rival organizations, using federal investigators as unwitting tools to eliminate her competition. Carmen Griselda was arrested without incident. When federal agents approached her, she didn't resist. Instead, she smiled and said something that would become legendary. "I was wondering when you would figure it out. I thought it would take longer." The federal court proceedings that followed were unlike anything in American legal history. Prosecutors had to prove that a woman everyone believed was dead had actually been alive and operating the largest criminal enterprise ever documented. Griselda's defense attorneys argued that their client couldn't be prosecuted for crimes committed by Carmen Vasquez because Carmen was a different person with a different identity and different physical appearance. The legal battles lasted for over 2 years, during which investigators continued to discover the scope of what Griselda had accomplished during her 6 months of being dead. They found that she had established operations in countries where American law enforcement had no jurisdiction. They discovered that she had recruited personnel from legitimate businesses and government agencies. They learned that she had created the most professional criminal organization ever documented. Most remarkably, they found evidence that Carmen's community investment programs had genuinely improved conditions in dozens of impoverished neighborhoods throughout the Americas. In 1986, Griselda was finally convicted on multiple federal charges and sentenced to life in prison. But the method she had pioneered during her 6 months of being dead became the template for how organized crime would evolve throughout the rest of the 20th century. Griselda had proven something that criminologists are still studying today: that with sufficient intelligence and strategic thinking, it is possible to build criminal organizations that are not only invisible to law enforcement, but actually beneficial to the communities where they operate. The 6 months when everyone thought Griselda Blanco was dead became a case study taught in law enforcement academies and business schools around the world. Griselda's fake death wasn't just a deception, it was a transformation that allowed her to build something that transcended traditional categories of legal and illegal, beneficial and harmful. She had become something that the legal system wasn't equipped to handle. A criminal who had made herself indispensable to the communities she served. The death that wasn't had given birth to something unprecedented, a criminal empire that made the world better while making its creator impossible to stop. That was Griselda Blanco's greatest achievement, proving that the most effective criminals aren't the ones who break society's rules, but the ones who make society's rules irrelevant by building something better. Griselda Blanco spent 6 months dead and used that time to become immortal, not through legend, but through building systems that continued to function long after she was gone. Systems that are still operating today. Still invisible, still effective, still proving that she never really died. She just learned how to live without anyone knowing she was alive. And that made her more dangerous than she had ever been. Because dead people can't be arrested. They can only be remembered. And Griselda made sure she would be remembered for all the right reasons, even by people who never knew her name. That's the legacy of the death that wasn't, and the life that became everything.